Welcome back to another episode of How Did It Make Sense, in which we try to explore that local rationality of those people who are undertaking activity, high-risk activity. It could be in aviation, could be mountaineering, could be diving. And in this case, we've got a slightly different perspective because it's about unmanned or uncrewed air systems and an event that's been reported, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that. And to help us understand these stories, I've got Mike Mason, who is a human diver instructor based in Brisbane. Mike, tell us a little bit about your background, who you are, and how you got to where you are, and where people might be able to find you if they want some more information about the work you do.
Cool, thanks, Gareth. Well, as you say, I am now a human diver instructor. My full-time job is actually a flying instructor in the Australian Air Force. Now, people listening to this who understand accents will probably tell that I'm not Australian by birth. So my background is the Royal Air Force. I did 20 years in the UK military, mostly flying fighters on frontline fighter squadrons. And throughout that time, I got more and more interested in the human role in why we do what we do. It wasn't just the systems and the technology and all those sort of things. I was really quite fascinated by the human factor. Later on in my career, probably about 2018, 2019, I think, I came across the human diver. And by that stage, I was a really passionate diver as well. And I thought, this all makes sense to me. I love all this. All the concepts just were completely logical and related to what I did in flying. And I realized that the diving world was so, let's call it, far behind the world of aviation in terms of understanding human factors. So I'm sure you'll recall that I reached out to you and said, hello, this is me. I'd like to get involved. I'd like to do more. And the rest is history, I suppose.
Yeah.
Although what's quite interesting is, I joined the human diver team probably in 2020, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, this is fine. Gareth will just tell me some stuff that I already know because I've been doing human factors for years. And then the more I realise as time goes on, the more I realise I don't actually know about human factors, and there's still so much more to learn, which is great. That's all part of the journey as well. It's my learning as well as the people that I help educate, bring on the journey as well. So I was going
to say you're not on the non-diving side as well, so you're doing some other work as well. Yeah,
that's it. So my human diver, or my knowledge of human factors through the human diver, I now take back into aviation. I think I've got much more of a knowledge base there, and I've now started a company in the corporate space with a colleague of mine, Sam, called On Target, and we're trying to take our knowledge and experience from aviation, combined with our passion for human divers, to help teams in the corporate world improve their performance. So please feel free to have a look at that on targetteaming.com. Reach out. We're based on the east coast of Australia, but we can travel pretty much anywhere to help teams perform. That's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And the whole sort of the learning piece, it's a continual journey. And what I learn from the instructors and the feedback that I get and the constant stuff that's on LinkedIn and bouncing ideas off each other. And I think that's the bit, is you've got to continually learn. And that's really what this podcast is about, is getting people to explain stories, tell stories, and then dig into the background to help them learn, because the key is the ability to abstract it from one space to another. I originally took with the human diver is people are people, take stuff from aviation, take it from healthcare, take it from nuclear, oil and gas, repackage it, put it into the diving space. And it just means that the theory is broadly the same, and all you're doing is you're packaging stories on top of things. And I'm really hoping that this podcast will get people to explore some of these ideas. We've got a wildland firefighter, got somebody talking about garbage men, got mining, got a marine auditor. So, it's all understanding, in effect, this messiness of the world and what the messiness of work looks like. And often what we hear are these simple first stories, which are linear, they're full of counterfactuals, but they're really believable because of the way that we're wired. We want to go, yes, that's the reason why. And it's quite easy to sort of pin blame on somebody because we don't have that story. So can you start with that first story then, Mike? What is it we're going to talk about this evening?
Yeah, okay. So there's a accident report which appeared on LinkedIn about a month or so ago, which I've really found quite fascinating. So I thought I'd have an in-depth read and try and come up with a human factors lens viewpoint of the incident. Because the first person story is a UAV, an MQ-9, which is also known as a Reaper in more colloquial language, took off from an airbase, and shortly after takeoff, it slowed down and crashed, and it was all the mission crew's fault. And everything that went wrong was down to them, and that was it. And it cost the U.S. Air Force some $20 odd million. Thanks very much. Discipline, it will be afforded, and that's it. We'll move on.
And that sounds very 1960s, 1970s, 1980s aviation world of you were last to touch it, it's your fault. And the aviation world started to look at the sort of cockpit voice recorders, look at the data tracks, and sit there and go, hang on a minute, there's much more to it. So it sounds very simple, and very historic, but it's quite surprising that that's the case. So what's the second story? What's the context that we think has happened here? Obviously, we can't speak to the crew, so we've got this, this report, but we can try and fill some gaps in. So back over to you, Mike.
The second story, the context is massive. There is so much to it, and people like, as you said, people like these linear relationships. This caused this, caused this, caused that, and therefore the this at the beginning, well, that's the problem. This one, it's not that simple. There was a previous Reaper crash sometime before. Don't think it really specifies in the report when that happened, and let's call it the learning points, but let's say the conclusions from that report led to this crew having a certain mental model which influenced their decision making. There's also aspects of what we call crew resource management or cockpit resource management, how the crew interacts together and the history behind that. Are they actually working as effectively as they should be, as the US Air Force would like them to be? There is mention of checklists, and it gets to step 22, I think it is, of the takeoff checklist. And at that stage, something is done incorrectly, and that then leads to, or the first story would have you believe that leads to the final accident happening. But then you have to think, well, okay, you've got a checklist with already 22 steps in here. How many more steps are there? And most people who, let's say, know something about checklist design would say that sounds a little bit excessive and therefore is likely to lead to error. So there's lots more backstories, lots more factors at play, lots more things to consider in this particular outcome, I think.
Yeah, and so having read that report, one of the challenges, I think, with these sort of UCAS systems is the control station is often in a different time zone to where the operational platform is. So they will have a local base where they can get airborne from, but it's remotely controlled. And so from one of the bits picked in there is time zones and circadian rhythms that apply, and often working 10, 12 hours out from when people are called. And so fatigue becomes a factor in this as well.
Yeah, and fatigue's an interesting one because a lot of the aviation aviation incident reports and accident reports that I've seen, they often cite fatigue as a factor, but fatigue is really easy to spot with hindsight. And my day job still involves flying aeroplanes, and I think it's extremely likely that I've been to work and carried out my normal work while being a little bit fatigued, but I don't feel fatigued at the time. And generally, you want to try and spot fatigue in other people because you can't spot it in yourself. And if I were to say to the people at the sharp end, in this case, the mission crew of this UAV, hey, we're about to go and launch an operational mission, therefore the underlying second story perhaps is it's quite important. And I say, how do you feel? Do you feel too fatigued to go to work? They're probably not going to say yes unless they fall asleep in front of me, because that's human nature. That's how we operate. And it does take a supreme amount of moral courage, probably an unrealistic amount of moral courage for an actual crew to put their hand up and say no. And that therefore relies on the chain of command or supervision to look at their people, manage their rosters, their off time, etc., to make sure that you are doing your best to minimize the chances of people being fatigued when they're actually performing quite critical tasks. So there's lots to do. Fatigue is a really important one.
And I think, anybody who's involved in air operations in Afghanistan and operating the sort of the long haul flights that took place there, of crews regularly falling asleep on the way home, and you sit there and burning up hours, and it was quite a scary thing, really, where you sort of wake up and go, oh, anybody else awake? And so try to take turns. Now that's easy on a multi-crew aircraft and a single seat jet. That's you don't really have somebody else who can sit there and go, hey, wake up.
No, well, I can go on a bit of a sidebar there, but it goes without saying that single seat aircrew, or single seat jets rather, it's more of a problem because it's just you. A friend of mine fell asleep in a single seat aeroplane on the way back from an operational mission, and he was woken up by I think he'd left the throttle wasn't in auto throttle, so the aircraft was gradually accelerating, and he got woken up by the aeroplane telling him he was going too fast. And it started bleating in his ear. He was flying straight and level because he told the autopilot to keep going straight and level, but it was slowly accelerating. And when it got to a certain speed for one of the stores that was carried, the airplane exactly the airplane started talking to him and saying max speed, and then he woke up and realised, Jesus. And we had that culture where he could talk about it and actually share his story. Which was great, really useful. It's all touch wood. It's almost happened to me before. I don't think I've actually had a micro sleep in an aeroplane, but I've certainly come close. 8-9 hour missions in the Middle East when you're on the way home and the adrenaline starts to subside. You are tired and there's just you, and all you've got to do is try and find a way to stay awake for the last 2 hours flying over the desert with not much to look at. It can be a challenge.
Yeah. So going back into this report, this fatigue wasn't it was dismissed by the sort of chain of command, but actually when you listen or you read some of the other comments that were made, it's like maybe there was something, and I think there is that piece of if an organisation is stuck with its crews and it can't do anything about it, it's almost that bit of just man up and deal with it, and hope that nothing goes wrong. And if it is sort of has a fatigue contribution to it, you sit there and go, well, what can we do? If we're limited in our crews, but we still have an operational tempo to meet, how do you manage that? So what are the things that did you pick up in that report that sort of indicate that there's more to the story than is written down, or there's more questions, better questions that could be asked when looking at an adverse event?
Right. Well, the easy place to look for that is there's a paragraph fairly early on where it's entitled purpose, i.e. what is the purpose of this report? And I've got it in front of me. I'll pick out a couple of words. This report, or the team that was tasked with conducting the report, conducted a legal investigation to inquire into the facts and circumstances, to prepare a publicly releasable report, obtain and preserve all evidence for use in litigation, claims, disciplinary action, and adverse administrative action, i.e., how can we keep this simple? How can we find what to blame, who to punish? How can we move on quickly? There is no mention of learning. What can we change? What can we adapt to? How can we improve? Those words, which are in modern safety culture, certainly where I work now in the Australian Air Force, that's exactly what we're talking about. Every report is the definition is this is here to learn and improve and change and adapt, which is complete contrast to the report we're actually talking about here today. And that's really frames the whole thing, and is by far the biggest part of the problem. Yep, sets the tone most definitely.
And I think it's that piece of potentially an organisation protecting itself in the language that's used. And as you say, that then frames the rest of the report, which, you sort of look through, and I'll upload it into the sort of the show notes area so people can look at these things. But the language is not really conducive to learning. It's not about understanding the local rationality of the mission crew and the decisions they made, which must have made sense to them at that time. It's all about non-compliance. It's, there's miscommunication or stuff that wasn't talked about, or things were dismissed. And it's that piece of what does normal look like in such an operation? So can you think about some of the bits about what does normal look like, or some of those questions that may have come to your mind when you're reading that report?
No, well, that would certainly be the place to start. What does normal look like? And in this particular report, it talks about I mentioned that the takeoff checklist, which has 20 odd steps, and the report mentions a few, let's call it critical errors that applied in this particular accident. However, there's no inquiry or curiosity about, okay, well, do people regularly make mistakes on this checklist? Does CRM break down in other situations which doesn't have an adverse event because things aren't reported? That's what I would like to know. Those kind of what does normal look like in other less serious outcomes? And there's just no real inquiry into that, which I think is a bit of a shame. What else have we got in here? So we'll go back to CRM. And what does normal look like there? There's lots of discussion of the dialogue between the pilot and the MSO, the mission systems operator, and how they were supposed to conduct, or the report implies they're supposed to conduct what we call challenge and response, which is where a challenge is issued by one person and then the response is carried out by the other one. But the way it's worded is that I think you can just do this you're supposed to do this as much as possible. Okay, well, what does that mean? Because there's no
Hmm.
real line in the sand. There's a lot of grey. And again, what does normal look like there? How do crews routinely do this? Are certain things always done challenge and response? Are certain things always done individually? And is there a mix in between? Because it would be really nice to iron that out and figure out, well, how many near misses do we actually have that don't
Hmm.
result in accidents because people just cope all the time? So there's plenty of examples in there where normal behavior is not investigated at all. It's just find the guilty party. Who can we hang
Yeah.
out to dry? In this case, the mission crew. There's also it talks about a previous accident where an MQ-9 crashed sometime before, and the outcome of that was various failures that impacted the mental models of this particular crew. But there's no real digging into, well, okay, so do other people behave in different ways, perhaps based on the outcome of that other report, and they've actioned different things differently? There's no real outcomes again, or that came from that
Links
implied
to other
direct
ones.
learning and change. Yeah, it's just all very one way. Yeah, one-way learning, assumptions made. We've blamed somebody else for a previous crash. Now let's just move on. There's nothing in there. Or
Can you
another one,
talk through?
actually.
Yeah, go
Go
on.
on. No, another one is to do with the heights at which certain actions are performed after takeoff. And again, the report talks about there are there is a height where some crews do it this way, other crews do it a different way, but there's no real line in the sand about what we should do. And if the crew had done it at this height, they would have had enough height to recover. Well, okay, brilliant. It doesn't really help us. Actually, what are we going to change? What are we going to put in place? How can we actually adapt to make sure that things like, or to minimize the chances of things like this happening in future?
Yeah, and I think there was the piece about it, in effect, was a loss of power and not detected until sort of too late to recover. And what does that look like? Are those part of the training protocols? Is it a surprise effect? The flying for the some of these mission pilots is fairly limited in numbers of hours
Mhm.
per month, and so in emergencies need to be sort of ingrained and dealing with that. And if it's an unusual failure mode, then you're going to get a sort of a surprise startle effect, and it takes time to process and understand what is happening, especially if it's not something that you normally practice in a simulation. And I think there's a real sort of judgmental approach on they should have done better, they should have paid more attention to what's going on.
Yeah, I think if you're going to read the amount of counterfactuals, i.e., should have, would have, could have, in the summary, it becomes quite distracting because you're just looking for words that don't really help us. And that's precisely it. Lots of they should have seen that the power had dropped. They should have seen that the engine wasn't producing any thrust. They should have seen that a certain switch wasn't made. Okay, brilliant. Why should they have
Yeah.
seen that? Where have they been trained? Has this been talked about? Has it happened before? Does it happen routinely? And there's just absolutely none of that. It's just very much very judgmental, very hindsight bias, and to be honest, very frustrating because there's just no examination of the crews have been trained in this, the crews haven't been trained in this. This is new, this is novel.
Yeah.
It happens. I was in the flight simulator yesterday morning actually for the Hawk aircraft that I fly, and I got given some symptoms of an emergency that I thought were one thing when they were actually something else. And it's because I've been trained in a certain way
Yeah,
to react to certain symptoms, and therefore you find yourself going down a certain rabbit warren, let's call it. And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
interesting how that happens, but it's also completely normal human behavior. And unless we reflect on it, things will keep happening.
Absolutely. And I think just that whole thinking about thinking is a really powerful piece. So I was going to put something on LinkedIn about Friday morning. So on Friday, I went down to a dive centre, an inland dive site in the UK, to do some work on, in effect, emergency action planning. What would we do if we lost a diver and we didn't know where they were because they were lost? But it's that bit of, there are 50 divers in the quarry. Which one is our missing diver? And we basically went through a decision-making protocol and came to some decisions. But the interesting piece was where as I was driving down, thinking about my thinking. So about 10 miles from here, the dive centre is about 35 miles away. About 10 miles from here, I followed, I joined in behind a car, and we were driving down some roads, and they kept on taking the same roads that I did. And I'm thinking, it's got to be a complete coincidence that they're going to the same location that I am. And we got to within about a mile and a half of where we were going, and it carried on, and I turned left. And it was
Yeah.
like, wow. And I was just like, really? Are they really going? And the more we get into that confirmation bias, the stronger it is that that's the truth. That's the truth. Oh, no, it's not. And it's a really interesting piece of just how do we reflect on this? And so I was just thinking of another piece about the way that the report is structured and the framing. So the report's written with an executive summary on the front. And
Hmm.
most people will read that exec summary before, if they're going to read the whole report, they'll read the exec summary and then they will go into the main report. Whereas the exec summary is there for very senior people to sit there and go, yeah, this is what's happened. But even that exec summary is full of counterfactuals and really frames the discussion that happens afterwards.
Yep. Yeah, it uses words. There's a phrase in there. I've got it in front of me. The mission pilot failed to comply with the takeoff checklist guidance to move the throttle to 100% after initiating blah blah blah. Okay, great. So that instant word failure, the pilot failed. That just
Mm-hmm.
frames it like, pilot failed, case closed. Right, let's go and have a coffee. Doesn't help us. There's another. The cause was, yeah, the mission pilot failed to accurately analyze the cause of the MA deceleration in time. Okay, brilliant. If there's no learning here at all. It's just
Yeah.
telling you, yes, it is arguably doing what the report sets out to do. It is finding the facts. It's only finding the final fact. We mentioned the linear relationship earlier. Oh, well, fact A was caused by fact B, which was caused by fact C. There is no, you've got fact A here, there is no B, C, and D. And actually, do you know what? You need about 10 alphabets to see how it all fits together. It's just not that simple. We want it to be linear, but it's not. When things like this go wrong, there are so many things that come together, move apart, and ultimately combine in such a unique way that result in an accident like this happening. And we need to dig into all of those things if we want to actually learn, change, figure out how to adapt and avoid things happening again. It's not easy. I get it's not easy. But if you really want to save yourself another $25 million by crashing another one of these things, it might be worth the investment.
Yeah. And it's an interesting piece where, again, sort of go back to that thinking about thinking and the local rationality that exists in the organizations. So often we focus on the local rationality of the frontline operator, in this case, the mission pilot, the mission systems operator. But actually, the supervisory chain has got local rationality. The organizations have got some level of local rationality. So you sit there and go, right, what is their purpose? So we are, in effect, judging their reporting because we're taking it from a perspective of we want to learn, we want to create better organizational learning to help frontline operators. But actually, from an organization's point of view, what they might just want to do is, we'll just basically write a very simple linear report that protects ourselves as an organization. We transfer that liability down to an operator for not being competent. And you know what? It's not our problem anymore. So it's an interesting piece of understanding the rationality of others within the system, because we can quite easily judge a report because we've got a bias and a perspective to have as well.
Yeah, and I'm great at judging reports because I've definitely got a bias towards wanting to learn and improve and change. And you read things like this, and the report is not about learning and improving and changing. It's about finding the person to blame, the lowest common denominator, in this case, the mission crew, or probably the mission pilot more specifically, and then the Air Force can wash its hands of it. And in
Hmm.
terms of a legal responsibility, let's call it, because fortunately nobody was killed, which I guess makes things, let's call it, easier from a legal point of view,
Yeah,
then yes, they can just blame the pilot, and that's the agenda of this of the wider chain of command who's doing the investigation. But it's frustrating, isn't it? Because while you can blame the pilot and kind of figuratively wash your hands of it, in reality, this is a United States taxpayers' asset, and it's an
yeah,
exceptionally expensive one, and that affects if you want a better description, you as the person investigating, you as the person writing this report, you're all in this together. You're all part of the same team, like it or not. We're all on the same
yeah,
side. We're all trying to fight these wars for the right reasons, and therefore, if this report, if learning doesn't occur, well, in the short term, I feel happy as the investigator because I've done my job. I've found out who to blame, but I'm
mm,
just going to have to investigate another one soon, and I'm going to blame somebody else. Whereas actually, if I can get some learning out of it and change things, my job gets easier, and I save the taxpayer potentially another $25 million when we don't crash another one.
yeah,
But people just don't have that mindset. You have and culture is a massive problem. Biases are a massive problem. We're just ingrained to want to blame somebody else. It's not my fault. With the fundamental attribution bias would be a great example here. But it's and culture is a real, it's a difficult nut to crack, and I accept that. It's you're not going to solve things overnight, but the more you can just make little changes, little influences by just getting somebody to frame something in a different way or look at things in a different way, then you can change one person's mind. That can have an impact on somebody else. It's all going to be baby steps, but the more you can
yeah.
try and do that as an organization, the better the outcomes are going to be for everybody, including the taxpayer in this case. These things are expensive.
Yeah, and I think one of that bit about changing the language is a really powerful thing to look at. Is look at how did it make sense? What's that local rationality? And the way that the U.S. Air Force operates, they use human factors analysis and classification system as their
Hmm.
guide, and the
Yep.
categorizations or the categories help the investigators because it provides them a structure to say that's one we can put it in, that's a bucket we can put it in, that's a bucket we can put it in. But what it doesn't help is the interactions around those elements. As what is the organizational level factors, and that was one of the things that I noticed in that report. It talks about we use HVACs. We're going to talk about the different levels within the system, but there's no real organizational factors that are captured in the nano codes at the end where it breaks them down and you've got sort of preconditions and things. There's no organizational and there's no real supervisory factors that get captured, which would be really unusual for a failure in a complex system like an MQ9 operation. And that's what and you sit there and go, okay, so is the investigator or the person, do they know about organizational systems? Do they understand those higher level factors? And if you will find what you go looking for. So if that frame of mind of the investigator goes in there and says, right, I'm going to look for pilot error, or that's the reason why this happened. Well, you know what? I'm going to go and find that. I'm going to have that confirmation bias. Oh, found one of those bits. Stick it in that category. Yep, got another one. But
Hmm.
actually, if they don't understand the higher levels that exist within the system and the drivers, then they're not going to go and interview people. They may not be able to interview those people. And so you can't write about something you haven't collected data on.
Agreed. And there is little collecting of data beyond that final piece of the puzzle, that end of the linear chain. The human factors thing is interesting in this report. It feels like a bit of a perhaps a box ticking exercise. People are aware of human factors these days in accident
Mhm.
investigation, which is a pretty good start, obviously. But it's more, they've listed the various let's call it tick boxes of human factors that took place in this incident, but then there is no deeper learning. Okay, well that happened. You've got ineffective team resource management. Yeah, okay, that happened, and we've talked about where, i.e., there's evidence on the recordings of the mission, how the communication wasn't as it was, let's call it, supposed to be. All right. Well, the crew thought they were behaving, let's call it, normally. There's no evidence that it was unusual. So, do they behave like that all the time? Is it normal behavior? Is that
Mm.
a normal decision, local rationality that we talk about? And if so, well, does that need to change? Do we need to actually change bigger picture, culturally, organizationally, to adapt and improve? And there is very little of that. It's very The human factor side of it is certainly very, very box ticking, I think, and there's no real investigation
There's no
into
no real sort of
organizational culture.
evidence. Yes, there's no real sort of evidence behind it. And one of the things that was quite an interesting piece from a conversation that happened on LinkedIn because of this report being posted
Mm. Hmm.
was somebody had said, "Yeah, well, I looked at this from being an operating pilot, and I went to see where I could learn from it." And they there was, because there was a bunch of questioning saying, "So where's the organizational learning?" It's like, oh, I'd never really considered these reports as being organizational learning assets. But even at an individual pilot learning capability, all there is the counterfactual. They failed to, or they didn't do, or they should have done this. What it doesn't say is what the conditions or the distractions or the performance shaping factors that were present
Hmm.
that led to the decisions or the behaviors that are there. And it's those conditions and behaviors that we can explore and we can try and change. The quote from James Reason of, we can't change the human condition, but we can change the conditions in which humans are working. So
Yeah.
let's look at those performance shaping factors, those error producing conditions, and what can we do to reduce the likelihood that that then sort of feeds into the cascade.
Yeah, and I think that's the key part to it. And this report will very much focus on, well, this went wrong. They failed to do that. They should have done this. And so somebody looking at this report can say, right, what can I learn from this report? I'm a pilot. I want to learn how to improve. Well, in future, I will know that if the power reduces unexpectedly, I need to look in this particular part of the screen, this tiny little corner where there's a number. And if that number says 0, I need to do something else. I need to move the throttle forward. Well, okay, if you have if you find yourself in a situation that exactly replicates these circumstances, then yeah, those steps may well help you having a different circumstance. But the point is, if you look, we need to look at those wider organizational factors. Why the checklist itself is very complicated, and the way that it's supposed to be done, challenge and response, there's a lot of gray in there. So while you might have a particular set of circumstances in this outcome, the chances are there's multiple other and an infinite number of
Yeah.
possible combinations that could happen again because of the organizational factors, because of the local conditions, because of the way that crews routinely operate. And actually, you have to do what you can with all of that stuff to standardize things, train crews for more likely outcomes, watch what normal behavior is and see where the gaps are, and then look at what we can actually do to minimize uncertainty, to focus crews' attention in the right place at the right time when things are starting to go wrong, such that it doesn't really matter what combination of things you have in future, not just this specific one from this accident. You're better prepared to deal with all those things potentially going wrong because you've changed the
Hmm.
conditions, you've changed the system, you've changed the organizational influences above you, so that when you get down to the sharp end, you're actually the pilot taking this MQ-9 off from the ground. All those uncertainties have been massively reduced and you're far more likely to have a good outcome. And
Hmm.
this report doesn't do that, and it doesn't certainly help for real learning. The particular sequence of events, yeah, fine, but the chances of that ever happening again in this particular sequence are almost zero. It's all the other sequences you need to prepare for.
Yeah, and actually that brings on to that bit where you're referring to the previous crash, and what were the learnings that came out of that? Because
Yeah.
then that shapes that. So you look at this report and you sit there and go, pay more attention, be careful, do your job properly. I don't think anybody goes to do their job badly. That's they're all professionals.
Yeah.
So what
Yeah.
is it that's shaping people's decision process? Now there might be an internal report that answers some of these questions. But then you'd wonder, why is that not made wider for other people? Because they won't be the only operators of the MQ-9, that squadron or whatever. So it's really is about that learning to go up and out from that particular event and sit there and what else can we learn?
Mm.
So it's a really, go on.
No, I was just going to say that's what this should be all about. How many other organisations out there can take this, can learn from it, can improve safety, performance, and money? Because that's what a lot of this stuff is about. Aircraft accidents are expensive. We want to save money.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that, sort of talk through the sort of the first simple story of pilot, pay more attention, don't crash your aircraft, to actually understanding that there's a lot more to it. And often we hear this piece of, we just wait for the accident report and that'll give us the answers. And you sit there going, maybe not. So yes, it's there, it's documented, but does it help us learn? And that then goes to the organisational level. What's the purpose of this report? And it quite clearly states it here. It's a legal liability protection document that says this is what we've done, and we're sort of transferring risk or culpability to somebody else. Whereas actually, where's the ownership from the organisational level? And that drives huge behaviours, because you sit there and go, if I don't have an accident that somebody is going to pick up on, then I won't report it. The sort of voluntary reporting for the near misses that occur, they all disappear underground because nobody wants to be the point the finger at you. And as military culture is get stuff done. And the number of people I speak to have said, I don't want to tell people what they do, because what I do and the problems we've had and the adaptations and the workarounds that occur, because if we do, they'll stop us doing what we need to do. And so there's this fear that the organisation goes, oh my God, they're breaking the rules, right? That's it, clamp it down. But they don't understand that actually to get the job done, to achieve the goals that are there, then adaptations and workarounds and local ingenuity are required. And as an organisation, if you aren't aware of those operations taking place, you as an organisation are holding risk that you don't know about. It's a hidden risk. And Clive Lloyd, who's out your way, he's got a great phrase of, you can't fix a secret. If you don't know about something, how do you go about addressing it until it goes bang? And then it's like, oh, there we go, look at that. It's like, and everybody goes, yeah, we knew that was going to happen. Well, okay, if you knew it was going to happen, why don't we say anything? Can't say that. So
because of culture.
So yeah, absolutely. It's that can-do approach, get stuff done, and drift occurs as normal. So, Mike, thank you very much for that. What sort of book or paper or video would you recommend that people go and dig into that sort of piqued your interest about learning more about sort of curiosity and understanding this local rationality?
If I were going to pick a book for somebody who just wants to have more of a knowledge or get more knowledge and understanding, I probably wouldn't go much further to start with than Sidney Decker's Field Guide to Human Error. It's quite easy to read. It's relatively short. It's got lots of deliberately simple diagrams and pictures that talk about local rationality, that talk about bias and things like that, and decision making. And it just puts things in a simple, easy way to understand, which definitely takes the focus away from the individual and looks at organizational conditions, performance shaping factors, and things like that. Sidney Decker's Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. That's where I would start.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Mike. And we'll see you soon on one of the instructor meetings. So thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day across there. Thanks very much.
Thank you.